Join gradually.
Okay, hello everyone, and a very good evening for those in Pakistan. For me in Calgary, it's 5 a.m. in the morning, and we are very thankful to Professor Mike Stephenson, who is joining us from United Kingdom. Mike is acknowledged expert in Paleozoic palynology and stratigraphy with around 100 commercial reports, 40 review papers purely in Middle Eastern palynology and stratigraphy, and 100 peer-reviewed papers overall. His particular expertise pertains to the Creek of palynology, including regional correlation projects in Alkalata, Gharif, Misaf, Misfar, Jauf, Unayzah, and Khuf formations, biostratigraphy data reviews, sampling strategies in high-resolution field biostratigraphy. Mike currently holds 4 visiting professorships at University of Nottingham, Leicester in the UK, and University of Ningjiang, China, and University of Milan, Italy. Mike is working as chief editor of the very famous journal of the Elsevier, the Review of Paleobotany and Palynology. He works as vice chair of the subcommission on Permian stratigraphy. Currently, Mike is managing a consulting firm, Stephenson Geoscience Consulting, and he previously worked as executive chief scientist at the British Geological Survey. So I'm not taking more of your time, and I'd like Mike to take away and start the session. Mike, over to you.
Thank you very much, Irfan. I assume that everybody can hear me. I hope it's not too early or too late for people who are hoping to see the talk, but I hope it'll be interesting. So I'm going to talk for about 50 minutes or so, about an hour, on palynological correlation of the Carboniferous and Permian of the Levant and the Middle East. And it's mostly a talk about reservoir rocks, less about source rocks. And it includes not only oil and gas, but possibly also groundwater, geothermal, and CCS, because the rocks that we are considering could be used for those purposes as well. So for those of you who are not very knowledgeable about biostratigraphy, particularly, so this is very basic. It really works like this. So for example, you've an area with a set of species which have a certain range within a set of layers of rocks. Then we can use that to basically, for example, a common species like species G there, which is common to 2 areas. We assume that it has an isochronous first appearance, in other words, appears at the same time. Then we can correlate that green layer. The green layer, is, under biostratigraphic rules of the same age. So what you need is easily recognizable species. You need widespread species, and be part of a sequence that is fast changing. That's really how biostratigraphy works. Visual correlation line using that common species G. So palynostratigraphy is the branch of biostratigraphy that deals with palynomorphs, or basically spores and pollen. And what you see there is some of the reasons why we might use palynostratigraphy. So things like big events, like for example, Chicxulub, like unconformities, like trying to understand paleogeography, big paleogeography changes, and also paleoclimatic changes and mass extinction. All of these big things can be used, you can use palynostratigraphy for. But this presentation is going to concentrate on difficult rocks. I mean, rocks which tend to be hard to correlate and are difficult to understand. So that's what this presentation will concentrate on. And again, if you're unaware of what palynomorphs are, it's just really spores and pollen. You can see broadly the size we're thinking of. So seeds, you can see on the left there, millimeters in size. Spores are usually 20 to 200 microns in size. So 200 microns is about 1/5 of a millimeter. So big ones you can just about see with the naked eye. And they're common in argillaceous rocks. And if you're dealing in boreholes, then you obviously find them in core, sidewall cores and cuttings. And here's an SEM picture of a few pollen. So that's what we're looking at. They are extremely common in some argillaceous sedimentary rocks. In substance rocks like coal, you can have millions of spores in a 20-gram sample. So they really are very, very common. When you're working in palynology, it's very useful to have consistent taxonomy. So if you're not aware of what taxonomy is, it's just really the system of names, the system of classification of fossil organisms. And for palynology, because it's a fairly new paleontological subject, there is a little bit of instability in taxonomy. In other words, the same things sometimes have different names. That's just because they've been described recently and because people weren't aware that something already had a name and have given it a new name. But when you're working in taxonomy, it's very important to have really a kind of common approach. So taxonomic keys are very useful. So this is a taxonomic key for the bisaccate pollen, for example. So the main advantage of that is that different palynologists, if they use a key like this, or if they use consistent taxonomy, should be using the same concept of a species. If they're using different ones, then you sometimes get problems. It's also very useful to have a mature palynological zonation. So a zonation of zones, fossil zones that people understand and have used and are established. So this is the Middle East, mostly the Arabian Peninsula. So this set of biozones is fairly well established. I published these in 2003. You can see the zones OSPZ 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. These are zones that go through the Carboniferous and Permian of the Arabian Peninsula. So it's quite useful to have this set of zones because they're established and you know more or less what species are in them and what ages they probably represent. You can see the lithostratigraphy here and the chronostratigraphy here. But one thing that's quite interesting about those zones is that in the past sort of 15, 16 years, it's been shown that those zones are applicable outside of that central Arabian area. So they're found in the Levant, in Turkey, in Iraq, in Iran, in Pakistan, in Yemen, and in Iran as well. And you can see some of the zones I mentioned earlier on, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, are found in these different areas. So it's quite useful, the OSPZ zones for the Middle East, basically. Some examples of where we've used the OSPZ zones. You can see Irfan here when he was much younger as a PhD student, when I was supervising him in the Kisor and Salt ranges in Pakistan. You can see the Tobra formation, the Sardai, and the Wacha formations. And we were able to use palynology to identify those zones and other zones as well. What's really useful about that is that you can use zones which you've established to correlate layers of rock which are important. So what's really interesting about this image here of the Kisor range, which shows the Amb, Sardai, Wacha, and Tobra formations, is that using the OSPZ zones, you can relate Middle Eastern, Arabian formations with a reasonable level of certainty. So the Kuf formation, the Garif, the Alkalata, and the basal Kuf clastics probably correlate with these formations, which means that all that knowledge from the Arabian Peninsula and all the knowledge in Pakistan suddenly comes together because you know you're dealing with the same formations. And of course, these formations in Arabia are really important, oil and gas. So Alkalata is a big oil formation, so is the Garif. The Kuf is the world's largest non-associated gas reservoir in Iran and Qatar. So it's really valuable to be able to do that. You can also use them in Yemen, so it's been possible to identify OSPZ2 and actually more precise, more high resolution zones as well in Yemen. So we've been able to connect Yemeni formations to Omani and Saudi Arabian formations, which wasn't possible before. In Iran, it's also OSPZ6 particularly is very well established in Iran. It's been possible to, in this recent paper, link lots of boreholes and outcrop to the OSPZ zones. You can see the zones here, OSP5 and OSPZ6. So what you're really seeing is that the Middle East and Yemeni, Pakistan, and the Levant as well are really not as different as they appear. Quite often the differences are just because you've got different geologists from different countries working on them. In fact, once you've done the biostratigraphy, you can see that they're very similar. So that's just an introduction. What I'm going to do is show you some more detailed applications of this kind of activity. So this is a field-to-field look at regional correlations and field structure. So we're dealing with the Oman Alkalata formation. For those of you who are not familiar with it, it's a glaciogenic formation. It's very similar to the Tobra formation in Pakistan. This is what it looks like at the surface in Oman. When it weathers out, you essentially lose the matrix, and all you have are the clasts, which are big granitic and other sorts of quite indurated clasts. And this is what it looks like at the surface. You also get these spectacular drop stones. It contains some of the biggest drop zones I've ever seen, huge boulders that must have dropped out of the base of big glaciers into the argillaceous matrix. It's really spectacular. There's some more pictures of spectacular drop stones, but you can also see varves and various glacio-deltaic sediments too. So it's a very interesting formation if you're interested in glacial rocks. Like classic tillites, you can also see like this one where you've got some largish drop stones and an argillaceous matrix. And perhaps why it's so interesting to the oil and gas world is that these reservoir sandstones also occur, or reservoir pebbly sandstones also occur associated with the diamictites. These are really good oil and gas reservoirs. You can see how they're quite high permeability and high porosity. But having said all that, one of the problems with this formation is it's extremely laterally variable. So this is a Wadi Alkalata, which is a small wadi in the south of Oman. You can see this the Alkalata formation on either side of the wadi. In fact, if you walk from one side to the other, there's extreme variability. The two facies look completely different, only 100 meters away, 200 meters away. And this makes it very, very difficult to correlate, particularly because the seismic in the subsurface, so this is the surface when this stuff is 1,000, 2,000 meters below the surface, the Kuf formation is in the way. And that means the seismic is very poor. So it's difficult to correlate just with logs. And I'll just show you how different those logs are. So this is a Hercynian field. These logs, these fields, these wells rather, only a few kilometers apart. You can see some similarity in some places, but also huge differences. So it's very, very difficult just to use the logs. And with the seismic being very poor, it becomes even harder. Sudden thickness changes, very uncertain connectivity of sands. And then also you get unknown penetration by these wells of older sequences without knowing. So you can suddenly go right through into the lower Paleozoic and not know it, because the lower Paleozoic is similarly sandy. So it's quite hard, even though it's nicely productive, it's quite hard to understand the Alkalata formation. Higher up in the sequence, above the Alkalata, there's a bit more lateral continuity. So there's a limestone here, for example, that sits on top of the Alkalata formation, which is known as the Saiwan formation. This is a summary of it. The Alkalata formation, this green box here, is quite difficult to understand. Above, you've got this Hayashi limestone or Saiwan limestone, which is a bit easier to correlate, because it's a marine formation that goes right across. The good thing about the palynology is it's been enabled us to actually divide into 3 pretty solid, thick biozones, P1, P5, and P9. That's the PDO or shell name for these biozones. And the palynology becomes probably the most important way of correlating in the subsurface. And I can give you some examples. So one of the things it enables you to do is link fields. So this is a series of fields across the south of Oman, and here are some correlation lines. And with those biozones that have been developed, P1, P5, and P9, and actually subdivisions of them, you can relate fields to each other quite well. So it's possible to see exactly how the Alkalata and Lower Garif looks. You can also look for trends, you can look for sand seal pairs, you can create 3D models for the Alkalata as a whole. But if we just take single units, so this is unit 1 or biozone 1 of that Alkalata formation, using the palynology alone, you can see huge thickness variations because of it's actually salt withdrawal and dissolution in the pre-Alkalata, and it's also a sub-pre-Alkalata glaciated surface. But you see these huge thicknesses. So unit 1 is very, very thin in places, very thick in others, and it just becomes very thick very quickly. So in one place it can be 100 meters, then it's suddenly a few kilometers away, it's 800 meters thick. So this biozone has helped us to really understand how that unit behaves. Without the palynology, we simply wouldn't have been able to do it. Unit R is a unit above, which is coming out of glaciation. It's slightly less affected by salt dissolution and by that glaciated surface on which the Alkalata was deposited. So it's a little bit less variable, but you can still see there's a variability in this unit. It's a very important seal across the south part of Oman because it seals the oil that's in these 3 units below. So understanding that seal is really important. Right, so that was an example of sort of field-to-field, larger scale regional correlation, which have been achieved using palynology. Here we'll have a look at a more detailed actual field structure. So this is a single field, Hercynian, in central South Oman. This is a published paper. It was based on a heavy oil steam injection project. Basically, the idea was to steam inject into a heavy oil reservoir in the middle and upper Garif, and then to use the Alkalata formation to dispose of the water, so the condensed water. So what the company wanted to know was what was the structure of the Alkalata formation and what were the sandstones like in the Alkalata for the disposal of this wastewater. So how could you dispose of this wastewater? What was the best sandstone in the subsurface that you could use to dispose of the water? So they asked me to have a look at this. So I had 500 samples from 12 wells. I had probably a few tens of sidewall core and core samples. I had a fairly mature palynostratigraphic scheme from elsewhere in Oman, but it was based on core, not on cuttings. And the problem with the sands is that they tend to contain few palynomorphs. What you find the palynomorphs in is the mudstones associated with the sands. So I knew it was not going to be an easy job, but basically I was able to use some of the biozones developed by others, including myself. So here, this is a publication 2008, which shows the biozonation, which you can see on the right here, which is based on more or less on quantitative amounts of particular palynology, palynomorphs. And you can see here, for example, between 2159 A and B, which are 2 important biozones. The main way of telling between them is by how much monosaccate, which is here, this is a monosaccate pollen. And you can see here that basically B contains more monosacchates than A. And you can see that here in this zonation here, here's the monosacchates, quite common, and here they're not so common. So that's considered to be 2159A and 2159B. So that's the distinction between the two biozones. In fact, this is very hard to use in cuttings because basically, although you have this set of monosacchates supposedly distinguishing biozone A from biozone B, in fact, these can all cave down. So I had to develop a new method to distinguish between 2159B and 2159A. And you can read the paper if you want to know how I solved the problem, but essentially I had to solve it in order to work with cuttings because cavings was such a serious problem. But basically what I was able to show was the structure of the field. I was able to establish 5 biozones, you see them there, and I was able to plot them through the field. You see a picture of the field here. Again, all this is published. What was I noticed straight away is that biozone D down here, this kind of pink purple zone, contains a lot of big sandstones. It's all the same age. It's interesting that it has a different depocenter to the rest of the Alkalata formation. And this is generally, the Alkalata formation is generally seen as a great big formation, roughly of the same age, roughly deposited during one glacial period, but, or at least glacial epoch. But what I think, having done this work, is probably biozone D represents an earlier glaciation, perhaps a lot earlier, maybe even in the middle Carboniferous or earlier Carboniferous, whereas the A, B, and C probably represent the glaciation much younger. But nevertheless, what I was able to show is there is a big pile of sands at biozone D level, which are all the same age. However, what I couldn't show was I couldn't show that these sands were connected. So I could only show that they're the same age and that they occur across the field. But I couldn't say, well, the volume of sandstone that you have at your disposal for getting rid of water is this number of cubic kilometers, because I couldn't show that the sandstones between these wells or these boreholes were connected. They could be affected by baffles of mudstone, or they could be affected by cutouts, stratigraphic cutouts. So basically, although we have these stacked reservoir sands, I don't know if they're the same sand. So there was a very, very large volume of sandstones, or 6 separate smaller volumes of sandstones. And that's really important. So I felt I'd got somewhere, but I didn't really solve the problem. I'll come back to that later on in the talk, because I've kind of thought about it more recently, and some of the new techniques I'm using can probably show you about connectivity. But now I'm going to quickly go to Iraq, to Western Iraq, and just show you one of the other really useful things that palynology can do. One of the interesting and important things about the Paleozoic, certainly the late Paleozoic in the Middle East, is that it's affected by a very powerful unconformity, which sometimes links or absorbs other unconformities, which can lead to enormous amounts of section missing. So if you look at this picture, you can see what we call the pre-Unayzah or Hercynian unconformity. And we're going across from Arabia to Yemen to Oman. But you can draw a picture like this across the Middle East generally. What it shows is that rocks here can be separated by a very small unconformity. So to the Wajid Formation in Yemen and Southwest Arabia, there's just a small gap. But in somewhere like the Central Arabian Arch or parts of Central Arabia, the Permian here actually sits on much older rocks, lower Paleozoic and even Precambrian. And so often the rocks beneath the unconformity are very similar. They're sandstones. So you can drill a hole thinking you're going through a whole sequence of Permian and Carboniferous, which is very nice. It's full of permeable and porous sandstones. But in fact, you're hitting, maybe lower Paleozoic, which is much tighter, and you didn't know that. So palynology can be very useful in pointing out where there are big unconformities. So this next study is really about how I use palynology to identify the pre-Unayzah unconformity. So this is a small picture showing Iraq, the Levant, and the Central Gulf. So the pre-Unayzah unconformity in this area here in the north of Saudi Arabia is difficult to be sure of because there isn't much core. And core is really important because caving can cause trouble in understanding the actual stratigraphic differences. For something like the Central Gulf, you actually have some core in this well, Abu Safa 29. So you're able to pinpoint the pre-Unayzah conformity and see how long its hiatus is, how long the period of time that corresponds to the missing rock associated with the unconformity is. But I was able, luckily, to have access to a really good well in western Iraq. And this is the bit of the stratigraphy that was basically I was dealing with. And what I basically had was this well, KH5/1. It's a deep water well. It's fully cored to 1620 meters. And there's probably an unconformity here, at about 670 according to Al-Hadidi, because there's a change in the lithology. And I think there's somewhat of a kind of erosion surface. So the question is, how much time is missing between the Ga'ara formation and the Raha formation? So I was lucky. I was able to get some really nice palynology out of these sequences. Note that the blue boxes indicate barren samples. So you don't always get palynology in these sequences, but these boxes here show where I was getting palynomorphs. Here's where the unconformity is marked. What I was able to basically show was there's an assemblage A and an assemblage B. Assemblage B has a particular character of bisaccate, monosaccate pollen. Assemblage A has a character really mostly of spores with a very, very rare pollen. And what you see really is the unconformity sat there between these two very different assemblages. What I was able to show was that basically these rocks are probably Westphalian in age, so it's easier to use the old names here rather than the newer Carboniferous names for various reasons. But what you can see essentially is a Tournaisian, the earliest Lemurian, and a Westphalian age with the unconformity in between, which means that either these rocks here contain a very condensed sequence of Lemurian, or the unconformity is cutting out quite a lot of the Lemurian. Probably the latter is true. So what we're able to do, therefore, is show that probably there's a fairly large hiatus associated with this Hercynian conformity in western Iraq. It's similar to, even with cuttings, you're able to identify it to the ST8 well here in northern Saudi Arabia. So in these areas, you have fairly short hiatus. The same is true in Abu Safa 29, but if you go west into Jordan, it's huge. So the pre-Hercynian conformity mixes with other conformities, and you get only the latest Permian resting on the Cambrian. And in the Arabian Arch, you've got the Permian resting on the much older rocks as well. The same around the Oman mountains. But I can't stress how important this Hercynian conformity is, because it's such a strong influence on your reservoir rocks, basically. Okay, so I'm going to go into the more sort of newer techniques in biostratigraphy now. So this is to do with actual reservoir architecture. So it kind of corresponds a little bit to the question I posed few minutes ago when I was talking about the Mukhaizner field, I was able to identify these sands, but I couldn't say that they were all linked together, which is really what the geologists wanted to know. But here's a nice picture of the Oman Kukuf outcrop area. This is the upper Garif Formation. You can see nice sand bodies here exposed. You can see these big, thick, stacked paleosols. And these sand bodies are drilled all over Oman in the subsurface beneath the Kuf Formation for oil and gas. But what the geologists want to know really is, are these sand bodies that we pick up in the many cored wells, are they in communication? Are we able to say that a sand body is 5 kilometers wide and 50 meters thick on the basis of, say, 3 or 4 wells? Can we actually discriminate flow units? So what I was able to do with some of the work more recently was be able to actually identify sands and stacked paleosols like these, but in the subsurface in Oman. This is again published. It shows you basically the sands, some sands here, and whoops, and you've got paleosols as well. And you can see the sand tracking across 3 boreholes, which may be a few kilometers apart. The question is that the same sand? That one, is it the same as that one? Is it the same as that one? Or are they separate? If they're separate, then you've got a much smaller reservoir. If they're one sand, then assuming that they are roughly the same thickness across the 3 holes, then it's really a big sand. So my problem here was to try and show that using palynology. So what I was able to do is using very high resolution studies. So this is really palynology at its limits. So you are sampling every centimeter or so, not the sands, because the sands don't yield anything. What you have to actually sample are the mudstones that sit in between the sands, and they're often very thin, maybe only 3 centimeters thick, but you kind of got to go for all of them. So it's very labor intensive. But what I was able to show is that packages of sands could be linked, and they're by tiny differences in the palynology. So to you, if you're not a palynologist, even if you are a palynologist, that set of palynomorphs there probably looks very similar to that set, but they are minutely different, and you can distinguish one set of sands from another because they contain, or their mudstones, their associated mudstones contain slightly different palynomorphs. So I was able to show that sets of sands have the same palynological signature. So paleoenvironmentally, it would suggest that they may be part of the same paleoenvironmental system and therefore could be continuous between the wells. But you still can't really say that we're certain that they're connected. Obviously, you might have pressure data from the wells, which would tell you that. But if you don't have pressure data, then you may have to use something like this. So let me go to the last section of the talk, really, which is the newest work. So what I'm going to show you is how I think we can maybe solve some of these problems of connectivity. So to do this, you have to go to Jordan, and you can see the Dead Sea here. You can see Jordan, and here Oman is just over here. And here's the Dead Sea in the middle. Now in this part of the Dead Sea, the east coast of the Dead Sea, we have some of the really beautiful Permian rocks exposed. And you're able to wander amongst these rocks and collect samples for palynology and also do the associated sedimentology. So again, if you have another look at it in 3D, this is the name of the formation, the Unna Formation. It's very similar to the Permian of the upper Permian of Oman and of Saudi Arabia. It's similar to the Pakistan Permian as well, to the Wacha and the other formations. Superbly exposed. It's It's very easy to get to. It's, as I say, an Upper Garif equivalent. This is very schematic, but it more or less looks like that. Fantastic place for field work. This is the Dead Sea here. It's minus 440 meters, so it's 440 meters below sea level. So you can wander in these mountains, and climb these cliffs, and all the time be below sea level, which is a very strange situation to be in. And you have to get rid of your normal geological hammer because it's not big enough or deep enough. So you have to buy yourself a great big pick like this in order to get the samples out. But it doesn't look like the kind of place you would get palynological yield. Any palynologists on the call would look at that and say you're not going to get anything there. But in fact, you do. And if you dig deep enough, you get some fantastic assemblages. Great pollen and spores. It's very hot, and but it's a great place for fieldwork. You can see the most incredible views. So here's the Oman Formation. This cliff here is about 500 meters high. You can see everything right in front of your eyes, in detail as well. Get up close to seeing all the sorts of things you would see in Oman. In one small cliff, you can see for 30, 40 kilometers along the coast of the Dead Sea. It's a great place to see these rocks and to go and sample them and understand them better. Essentially, you have field scale views. You can see me here, and I'm here in this picture somewhere, but this is 500, 600 meters high, this cliff, and you can see these. You can see the sands when you really get your eye, and you can see the channels, the structures of these difficult rocks. I described them as difficult earlier on. What I meant by that is they're complicated. They have a lot of different facies in them, and lots of erosional surfaces, and it's not easy to kind of work them out. So we had 3 field campaigns there. So myself and John Powell, who's a very experienced geologist in Jordan, and you can see this is the Dead Sea here, and here are some of the localities we visited. These are published in 3 or 4, I think 5 papers now. See the location of the Dead Sea here. And what we were able to do, or I was able to do, is working alongside John, I was able to sample many argillaceous layers. These are the red layers here that sit amongst these big sandstones. So I was really trying to test my theories about sandstone connectivity. You get really close to these mudstone layers. So, for example, here's a nice mudstone layer within one of these sandstones. You've got paleosols, you've got channel sandstones, and they've got beautiful shales with some fantastic plant fossils as well. So these have been studied for a long time by Hans Kerp and colleagues in Jordan. So I was able to get up close to these, really analyze them. Here's another one. It's a bit broken up, but you see the channel sandstone here. That's me. These grey mudstones, which enabled me to sample palynology in a lot of detail, get really close to these layers, so that I can begin to understand how they work. What myself and John Powell were able to do was basically analyze these big cliffs, these big sections, into channels, floodplain sediments, red beds, paleosols. So you can interpret these really big cliffs from the point of view of their complex kind of sedimentology and facies. You've got the Triassic above, by the way, and the Cambrian below. I mentioned that big unconformity, which is essentially along that dashed line. We were able to develop a sedimentological model of what are, as I said, complex and difficult rocks. It shows what we think the environment was like, so a sort of alluvial plain with lots of plants growing on it, peaty mires, point bars, abandoned channels, oxbow lakes, areas of desiccation on the surface, wave ripples, occasional estuarine incursion. and what that translates into the subsurface. So accreted channels, again, desiccation cracks, mudstones in between. So we're able to understand what these complicated systems look like. This is published in 2013. But what I began to find out after a while was that after sampling lots of these argillaceous units, so the sort of argillaceous units are associated with these little abandoned channels and with the point bars, I was able to notice that there were differences between the argillaceous layers, quite big differences. So this is quite schematic, but it shows you that there are lots of different kinds of argillaceous layers, really small ones that only extend a few meters sideways, and larger ones that might go hundreds of meters sideways. They're all very thin. What I began to see was that you get very specialized and unusual palynological assemblages, like this one here, in some of these smaller mudstone units, the ones which are only a few meters wide, and maybe a meter or less thick. They contain unusual things as well, like zygospores, which are the spores of zygonimatation algae, which are quite unusual, but they're very well preserved. And what they tended to be associated with was these smaller units, things like oxbow lakes. So this is a modern representation of these smaller units that are associated with the larger river, but which have been cut off from the river. So in these sort of smaller environments, you get these unusual assemblages. But you get more diverse assemblages like this, which are more typical of a larger kind of vegetation that might cover the landscape. In the wider mudstone units, which are tens and hundreds of meters wide, maybe a meter or so thick. And these tend to be associated with the larger river as opposed to the cut-offs. So the river here, for example, again, this is just a modern representation, but to point bars, for example, on the river. So this contains all the sorts of things you'd find in the other unit, but also things like these bisaccate pollen, which are probably from uplands far away, maybe tens of kilometers away, that have come along the river. But you don't find these so much in these smaller units. So my explanation is fairly simple of this relationship. So this is, again, is a modern environment of oxbow lakes and rivers. So the sediments of an isolated body of water, like an oxbow lake, seem to be containing a higher number of local plants. So the plants just growing around the oxbow lake, whereas the main river, which you can see here, has sediments which contain a wider range of palynomorphs from a wider environment, because basically the river is draining a huge area, and therefore the river is enabling a much wider representation of pollen and spores from across the landscape. Whereas this, although it contains those spores and pollen, is much more dominated by purely local things which are growing just right around that oxbow lake. So you might say, what use is all of this? Why bother trying to understand this in such detail? What it means is fairly simple. You could, using this method, essentially tell purely palynologically between a wider mudstone horizon, in other words, a reservoir baffle like this, and a smaller baffle. Again, you may have pressure data from these two wells, in which case you know what was compartmented and what wasn't, or what was connected and what wasn't. But without that data, purely using palynology in these environments, you could theoretically tell between a narrow baffle and a wider unit like this. So, in other words, tell something about how compartmentalized the sandstone is by these reservoir baffles, by these mudstone layers. because one has a very different palynological signature to the other. It needs more work to prove that it can actually be applied, but it looks like it works. So the ultimate aim is to split a sequence like the one you see there into sets of packages which we know have a similar age, which are genetic related, and where we know something about the mudstones, associated mudstones, lateral persistence or lack of persistence, which kind of helps us understand the plumbing, the connectivity of the reservoir. I agree, it's not telling you everything, and pressure data could tell you quite a bit, but it's a help to understanding that. So it goes to some way to trying to explain or to answer the problem that I defined earlier in that study of the Unayzah field. I could prove that there were big sandstones. I could prove that they were, of the same age, but I couldn't prove that they're connected. Using techniques like this, you could show to some extent the amount of connectivity, the architecture of the succession. Just a few final minutes. This is important for oil and gas, but it's going to be important for things like carbon capture and storage and things like geothermal. So I'm moving away from the Middle East now into the UK. So this is a very nice picture of a quarry not far from where I live called Frogsmouth Quarry. It has a sequence of right angles. It's the Wilmslow Sandstone formation. And offshore, this is a target for carbon capture and storage. Onshore, it's a geothermal resource. So in parts of Cheshire, for example, in England, they're hoping to use the sandstone where it's buried to a few tens of meters as a possible warm water or warm water source, or a source or a way of storing heat. And looking at these sandstones, the Sherwood Sandstone group, the Wilmslow Sandstone, previous workers have essentially divided those Triassic sandstones of England, of the UK, into two types, a layer cake and a jigsaw. Here's the layer cake, and here's the jigsaw. Jigsaw is a jigsaw because the mudstones have been chopped up by erosion surface, or they're naturally confined by their own sort of genesis, by their own formation. But you can see that if you're injecting carbon dioxide through CCS to this unit, it'd be very different to injecting CO2 into this unit. Same with extracting warm water. If you're extracting warm water through geothermal from this unit, you'd only have that amount of warm water, whereas from this, you might have a larger amount. So again, understanding the plumbing, the structure of these sandstone, mudstone, the complexes isn't just important for oil and gas, it's important for any use that you want to put complex sandstone reservoirs to, like aquifer, geothermal, or carbon capture and storage. What you really need are models like this to understand these sandstones so that you can understand their architectures and therefore understand what the best way of using them is. That might be injection of CO2 or extraction of warm water. So in conclusion, palynostratigraphy is very important, particularly where it's very hard to correlate just using the lithologies because they're so varied, and especially where logs don't work or where seismic is poor. So that actually means much of the Middle East because of the Kush formation. It's also good for correlating regionally, correlating in fields to understand the structure of fields. It's also important for identifying unconformities. This is all fairly conventional about palynostratigraphy. What I've tried to show you in the last few slides is that you can use more unconventional techniques to characterize argillaceous layers. So not using zones at all is completely different. normal zonation. And you can go to places like Jordan where these are exposed and try and understand these successions, and then apply that understanding to successions where they're mostly subsurface. So, for example, in Oman or in Saudi Arabia. It may seem rather long-winded and expensive, but in mature fields where drilling decisions depend on sand extent and connectivity. So, you've got a 50-meter thick sand, but you don't know how big it is either side of the well that you've drilled. It becomes really important. So it's a really useful technique, and it could be very useful for other reservoir uses. So, for example, carbon capture storage and geothermal, not geothermal. So that's the end of the talk. I'll just say that although as Irfan said, I was the Executive Chief Scientist of the British Geological Survey, I have moved away from the BGS and now have my own company, Stephenson Geoscience Consulting. I'm available for consulting right now. If you have a look on LinkedIn, you'll see my email address and my company website. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Mike, for such a nice talk. I will now like the floor to be open for question and answers. You can raise your hands and we'll pick your question so that there is some format. So if there's not any question, I would like to just roll the ball. Mike, can you see can you tell us the challenges that we have come across, or we do come across, in terms of taxonomy from one region to another? How do you think that can be solved? Because that's a very big challenge, as you discussed in your talk.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I referred to it at the beginning of the talk a little bit, in the sense that if you have people who use taxonomy differently, so if you have, for example, I'll just put my camera on. If you have people not realizing that some species is the same, but calling it different names, you can have a lot of trouble, because it may look like your sequences are a different age. And in fact, they're the same age. It's just that people are using different names for the same species. So the way that you solve that is by obviously having a taxonomy that everybody agrees, that everybody uses the same in the same way. And one of the ways you can do that is using a taxonomic key, like the one that I developed and I showed you on one of the slides. So within PDO, for example, that's Petroleum Development Oman, that taxonomic key was used. So everybody more or less used the same concepts for the same species. But the trouble is, if you go to South America or India or Australia, for no bad reason, but people sometimes will use a different species name. The key to it is really to make sure that people come together, so that they use the same. So it takes time, but eventually it does work. So, for example, taxonomy in ammonoids or goniotites or forams is much more stable because it's been in existence longer, and so you get less of this sort of trouble.
Yeah, I do understand that, because when you see in Pakistan, for example, it has been very recently established that oil companies are moving or believing on the usage of palynostratigraphy, and as you said, with time things will be more clear, and it will become more clear with interaction between scientists from different regions. So I have a question from HDIP professionals.
Yes.
It's a Hydrocarbon Development Institute, Mike. So they have a question.
Please open your mic.
Hello.
Yes,
Hi.
yes.
Okay, can you tell something about the hydrogen peroxide palynological preparation procedure? How much it affect you?
Okay. Yeah, I'm not an expert on processing. And in fact, there are people who'll be able to answer the question better, but I think that in general, the palynology that I've been dealing with, for example, deep wells in Saudi Arabia down to 20,000 feet or more, tend to need quite powerful processing. So, Schultz and nitric acid and that sort of thing. But in general, the material I deal with in Oman and Jordan, for example, the material actually needs only very delicate processing. It almost falls out of the rock. And things like hydrogen peroxide probably work quite well. Though I'm not, I don't process the material myself. We have a lab technician to do that. So, what was the gist of your question? Whether hydrogen peroxide is better than other methods, or what?
Alhamdulillah.
Yes. Sir, my question was that how much affect you the hydrogen peroxide procedure for palynological preparation?
Yeah, as I say, I know it's used to prepare, but I'm not familiar. I've not used it myself. I don't think our lab uses it. So I know it can be used, but maybe Irfan knows more.
Yeah, that's more of a processing. I think Abdullah had been my MS student. He's doing PhD with me right now. And the time when I came back to Pakistan, we had been struggling with establishing our palynology laboratory and had been playing with different techniques. It's on the top of my head, but yeah, I think it's more of a processing thing, and yeah, a technician is more expert on how to tell you that. But anyways, yeah, yeah. So if there's not any other question, I would like to ask my people would like to know about the recycling that happens in
Sir, sir.
palynostratigraphy.
Okay,
Yes.
Nasser, 1 minute. We will take your
Yeah.
question after this.
Okay. Okay. Can I continue? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, Nasir Khan, you can go on with your question. So Nasir Khan again has been my MS student, and he's currently doing PhD from Belgium, Mike, and he's working on source rock. Yeah.
Okay.
You can go on with your question. I can do mine later. Nasir Khan.
Hello, Professor Stephenson. Thank you so much for such a nice and incredible talk on source reservoir in the context of palynostratigraphy. But I have a question that you mentioned that when there is the lithostratigraphy and the lithologs are not working, then we are trying to tackle the problems with the help of palynology. But personally, I have noticed that normally in sandstones that are reservoir rocks, we have very limited chances for the preservation of palynomorphs. So then how we get control on the palynostratigraphy within the reservoir units?
Yeah, I mean, this is what I was saying all the way through that last part of the talk, is that palynology doesn't generally come out of the sandstones. You're absolutely right. Which is why they are difficult. But in many of these sequences, there are associated thin mudstone layers, like in that section, those big complicated sequences in Jordan.
Yeah.
And you can find argillaceous rocks which are associated with the sandstones. And you really have to sample them like crazy. You have to try and get all of them laterally and vertically. So for Jordan, we sampled hundreds of these units. And it's only from doing that that you begin to understand not only does the palynology change upward, i.e. stratigraphically, probably because of evolution, but also it alters sideways. So one mudstone unit, which is a few meters wide and maybe 30 centimeters thick, is very different to another mudstone unit half a kilometer away of the same thickness at the same stratigraphic level. The reason for the difference is not evolutionary, it's paleoenvironmental. And it's probably because it sits somewhere else on the floodplain in a different context on the floodplain. And that's why it's different. So it's only by studying these complex sequences, by sampling everything you can, that you begin to understand what these units look like. You can't do it directly through the sandstones. You're absolutely right. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try, because most sandstones have some mudstones associated with them.
Okay, fine, Professor Stephenson. And additionally, I would like that during the process of ketogenesis, most of the organic matter convert to liquid hydrocarbons. And then we are correlating the reservoir rocks with the source rock on the basis of organic chemistry, especially the biomarkers. But I have noticed somewhere in the literature that we can also do such type of correlation based on the palynomorphs. If we find palynomorphs in the source rock, and then consequently in the reservoir rocks, but those would be in liquid hydrocarbon form. So could you shed some light on that perspective that, yeah, it is an established field like the biogeochemistry or biomarkers or no? So
I mean, this is another strand to palynology. It's not related to my talk, but yes, it's true. I've done myself work on biomarkers, you know, associated with palynomorphs, trying to understand, you know, what the biomarkers tell you about the kind of burial history of the organic matter and its temperatures and everything else, but also the origin of the organic matter, because the biomarkers are different in, say, algal origin or in angiosperm or gymnosperm origin. So I agree with you. It can be very useful.
Okay, Stephenson, although I wouldn't like to bother the audience with my question, but since it's a good forum to ask the question, so just my last question, that is there any impact of the morphology of pollen and spores and their dispersal? For example, we have the bicycad pollens and monocycad pollens. So is it possible that from terrestrial as well as from transitional environment, it goes to the deeper marine environment, the bicycad pollens, as compared to the monocycad pollen?
Yeah, good question. I mean, in the past, palynologists have said that dispersal is very, very different, with different kinds of pollen morphology. And you're probably aware of the Neves effect, this idea that the bisaccade pollen or monosaccade pollen would tend to be more common during flooding events, for example, because they are supposedly wind transported. But in fact, other studies, say, for example, by Muller, I don't know if you know a study by Muller, and other recent studies have shown that pollen, monosaccade and bisaccade pollen, are moved just as much by flowing water as they are by the wind. So although I think it's important that different morphologies probably have different ways of moving around, I think overall you can't draw many conclusions. Because, for example, you know, if you have a look at bisaccade pollen, they're just as likely to have been transported by water as they are by air. So I think it's a bit dangerous to draw too many conclusions.
Okay, Mike. So,
we have a question.
Dr. Harun.
We have a question from Dr. Harun.
Dr. Harun, please go on.
Thanks, Mike. Very nice talk. Can we extend the regional correlation beyond the areas that you mentioned, like to Southeast Asia or other areas?
Yeah, good, very good question. Yeah, probably not, because I think in the area I'm talking about in the Middle East, the Tethys shore, if you like, the shore of Tethys, in the Carboniferous and the Permian, you broadly have the same climate, the same kind of conditions. But as soon as you move markedly south, for example, into more of Gondwana and less away from the Tethys, then the sequences look very different and the palynology looks very different as well. So, for example, as you come into the lower Garif, so early Permian, that looks very different in Arabia and Pakistan to the way it looks in Western Australia, for example, or in South Africa or in Southern Africa, where the glacial rocks are succeeded fairly quickly by coal-bearing Eka formation rocks, so big coal formations. That doesn't happen in Pakistan, in Yemen, in the Levant, in Arabia. So what it means is that there's a limit to the kind of power of this palynology. It's very good at a regional level, but when you go beyond that particular climate region, then the similarity between the assemblages becomes smaller, and so it becomes harder to correlate. And unfortunately, the Permian was one of the most differentiated periods in history in terms of plant morphology, which translates into spore and pollen morphology. So it's one of the hardest systems to correlate across the world, because it is so divided by phytogeographical provinces. It's unfortunate, but it makes it more interesting for people like me.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So if there are any other questions, you can raise your hands, please. So. Okay, Mike, I would like to see the challenges that come across while you're dealing with recycling in the palynomorphs, and particularly if you're dealing with ditch cuttings or well cuttings,
Yeah.
you know. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, reworking or recycling is a big problem. If you're not familiar, it means where older palynomorphs from older rocks get eroded into newer rocks, where you have essentially a set of palynomorphs which are, indigenous, which are part of the rock, but then a set of palynomorphs which have been reworked into the rock from below. So that can be a real problem if you don't know what age your rock is, in a way, because you can't tell whether the reworked ones are in place and the ones you've got which aren't reworked are caved in. So if you are dealing with a very reworked sequence and you're dealing with cuttings, it becomes really difficult because you can't tell what age things are. But let's say in core, where you roughly know the age of a rock, then reworked material is usually darker. Well, not always, but it's usually darker. It's obviously older. So it's a difficult problem. You can solve it. It's not impossible to deal with.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have any other questions?
No, we don't have any.
Okay, Mike, I think that was all. Thanks for your time. I understand you had to have taken out from your very busy schedule, and I'm thankful to the participants for joining the talk, and we will be uploading this talk after necessary edits on the YouTube channel, and I'll share with everyone interested. So you can go through that, and that's it, Mike. Thank you very much.
Thank you.